My name is Jeff Leeper. I'm the city councilor for Kitchissippi Ward, and this evening we're taking a look at the Parkdale and Carling proposal that has been put forward by Taggart. Just a couple of quick notes. This evening's meeting is an open house. It's an opportunity for you to get information from the developer, ask the questions that you have to ask. This evening, Kimberly, you're on the file as the city's planning lead, I'm guessing. Fantastic. So Kimberly is here, is the city planner on the file. She'll be listening to the questions that are being asked and some of the feedback that I know you're going to provide. Kimberly's job is over the course of the next several months to go back and forth with the developer, go back and forth with you, go back and forth with me, and determine whether or not she can recommend the development. Oftentimes in a proposal that is as complex as this, there are a lot of pieces of feedback that various different folks will give to the developer that they need to incorporate in order to get themselves on an approval path, if in fact that is the path that they are going down. So I'm going to just very quickly, Steph, I'm sorry, I'm assuming we're running this the way we normally do. I'm going to turn it over to you for an explanation of how the meeting will work, and then we'll ask the development team to introduce themselves.
Yeah, so I'll run through it quick just to kind of save on time and get everything moving as concisely as possible. So how it's going to work is first the applicants will walk us through about a 15-20 minute presentation of the plans for development. Sort of any information that they're giving, you can usually find in their application package that can be found on DevApps. So if you go look up DevApps Ottawa, then the address 1081 Carling, you'll be able to find the development application with all the related documents that you can review on your own kind of time. And then after that, we'll open up for Q&A. Since we're quite a few people tonight, I'll have a speakers list going for anyone who wants to raise their hand and speak, and I'll allow you to speak. Otherwise, you can use the Q&A function to send a question through text, and I'll read it aloud. We'll try and keep it to one question a person, just in the interest of time. Or if there's similar questions coming in, I'll sort of say that and give that all as sort of one question. If there's any issues though, please just message me through the Q&A and I'll at least try and answer you. With that said, I'll hand it over to the applicants to start their presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Braden Walker. I'm with Taggart Realty Management. I am the development manager on this project representing Taggart Realty. We have quite a few members of our development team here today. I'll just quickly introduce them so we can get started. We have myself, Braden Walker, Derek Howe from Taggart, who is the Vice President of Development. We also have Paul Black and Tamarina Hull from FOTEN, who are the planners on the file. We have Patrick Bisson from Hoban Architecture, who is the architect. Sherry Edwards from CSW Landscaping is our landscape architect. And Matt Mantle from Parsons, who is our transportation engineer. So hopefully between all of us, we can answer all the questions you might have tonight. The purpose of this meeting really is, like the councillor explained, to sort of present the development proposal in a brief form to you, give you the background and some information about what we're proposing to do, and hopefully have the public engage us in some constructive discussions in terms of what you're expecting to see or what you might prefer to see, and ask any questions you might have about development, and we'll try and answer those. And hopefully we can get everyone's questions in tonight, but we'll try and move through our presentation quickly so we can get to the questions as soon as possible. Just a couple of things before we get started. The project is going to be several years out, so it is not imminent. We have leases active in the existing medical building right now that are going to be active until about 2027. So this is not an imminent project for Taggart, but it is important for us at this point to obtain this or seek a rezoning of the property from a commercial office building to a high-rise residential development. So that's pretty much all I have to introduce the team. I think I'll turn it over to Tamara to start the presentation and go through at a high level sort of what we're proposing to do at this site.
Great, thank you, Braden. Could I get permission to share my screen? I've got a slide deck to go with the presentation. Awesome, I think I see it. Let's see. See if this is working. Oh, okay. That's where it always takes a moment. Okay. All right. Let me just check. Can someone give me a vocal indication that they can see the slide deck before I get started?
Looking good.
Okay,
Yeah,
perfect.
we can see it.
All right. So we walked through the introduction. So thank you so much, Braden, for doing those. So I will get started with the proposal overview. So we're looking at the piece of land we're looking at, the proposal is to have a 28 and a 22-story residential building. So it's 2 buildings and they will both have 6-story podiums. The proposed development has 462 residential dwelling units. Those are split between the 2 buildings. The proposed types of units are there's studio, 1 and 2 bedroom, and then 1 and 2 bedroom plus den. For those 462 units, 293 vehicle parking spaces are proposed and 342 bicycle parking spaces are proposed. And there is parkland dedication proposed along Parkdale Avenue. That's to the northeast of the site. And there's also a landscaped open space at the southeast corner. So those are the quick facts. With so this application, the reason that we have an application here today, it's required to, we're pursuing a zoning bylaw amendment. And specifically, we need to do that for 3 reasons. One is to permit the use apartment dwelling high rise. One is to permit the building height. And one is to permit loading in a yard abutting a residential zone. And you'll see in the presentation later on that the proposed area for loading is adjacent to a house at 425 Hamilton Avenue South. And so right now today, we're talking about the zoning bylaw amendment. At a future date, a site plan control application will be submitted. And that's where we would go into much greater detail on things like the landscaping and the building materials, like how we want to construct the building and what materials we use. Today, we're looking at the zoning bylaw amendment, so that we're thinking about the 3 things noted above, but you'll also see during the presentation later, Patrick's going to go through some areas that touch on things like landscaping and building materials to give you an idea of what we're thinking of. Okay, and so why is a zoning bylaw amendment being submitted? So as I mentioned before, there are 3 areas where the zoning bylaw we're looking to amend it, and also in a broader sense. So we're looking to respond to official plan policies where greater heights are contemplated. The zoning bylaw and the official plan don't always match perfectly. So there are sometimes policies in the official plan that they don't match perfectly in the zoning bylaw. So sometimes we have to tackle that and try to make them a little more harmonized. And one of the other challenges with this site is there's 2 different zones. So a zoning bylaw would allow us to create 1 zone. So everything is, it has the same policies there. So the site in context is, so we're looking at 1081 Carling Avenue. It's on Carling Avenue at the intersection of Parkdale and Carling and Hamilton Avenue. So it spans the entire width from Hamilton to Parkdale Avenue. It doesn't go all the way up to Ruskin. And the site is a little irregularly shaped. There's a bit of a notch in the northeast, and that's where the parkland dedication is proposed. So when we talk about the policies that are guiding this application, one really important one is the official plan, and we often look to the land use designation for a lot of that guidance. So the official plan has a lot of policies that we're looking at when we're working on this application, and one important one is its designation. So the blue pin on the map shows where the site is at Carling and Parkdale. And then as you can see, there's an arterial main street along Carling Avenue. So the site is designated as Arterial Main Street. And on arterial main streets, buildings of heights up to 9 stories are permitted as of right. And and then if you want to go taller, so high-rise buildings where we're talking about 10 or more stories, that's permitted as long as you go through the zoning bylaw amendment process. And so when we're another important schedule and sort of policy area in the official plan is the rapid transit network. So that's Schedule D in the official plan, and that shows us where there is transit planned and where it exists. So this map, we can see that there is an LRT planned for Carling Avenue. Carling Avenue is identified as a rapid transit priority corridor with an LRT planned. The legend shows that they're considering at-grade crossings, but we're looking pretty far into the future. So we're mostly thinking about it as this is a site where LRT will one day be built. And the LRT stop is planned right at the intersection of where our site is. So so diving also a bit deeper into the zoning bylaws. So this screen shows the many different zoning, different performance standards. So we have the site outlined in this dashed blue. So the south half of the site, that's designated as Arterial Main Street, Subzone 10, exception 2196. And then the north half of the site is Arterial Main Street Subzone 2, and that has a height of 11 meters. So part of this application is to create a new zone and make it the same for the entire site rather than having a split halfway through. And you can also see behind, like around the site, there's a variety of different zones. So to the west, we have more Arterial Main Street 10. It has it has the same exception there, and it also has a height limit. And then to the east, we have the Civic Hospital, which is zoned as well. And you can, it's a lot of numbers and letters, but if you're ever curious and want to learn more, you can look this up on Geo Ottawa and the city's zoning bylaws. So we have R3, which is residential, and we have some open space to the southwest, and then experimental farm to the south, but mostly looking at our site. So the next area that I also want to talk about is a pretty big question: why is 22 and 28 stories being proposed? So there's a couple of reasons. One is that the site size is quite large for what we have on Carling Avenue to work with. So this site has 4,293 square meters. This is one of the larger lots that's not yet developed or developing or currently in the development pipeline. There's not many sites of this size, and in particular, this site has it's a corner site, which is also a good subject for density. And we also we have it's a corner site, but it has 3 sides where it has streets, so that's quite useful. The density for this site as well. So if we think about its context with relationship to experimental farm, density is only possible on the north side of Carling. So the south side is experimental farm. So of course there's no density that could be there. That's not really a development area. Not for us at least. So there's, and Carling Avenue, as we saw with that previous OP map, the designation map, it's an arterial main street. That's generally an area where density is being directed to. And as well, there's existing and future transit on Carling Avenue. So there's many buses that run on Carling Avenue today. And there's also transit plans. So generally we want to direct density to where transit exists or is planned. And then the tower separation, so the way this was designed, there's distances that are there's a variety of guidelines and policies that we look to for direction on how we orient the site and how we orient the towers. So the site is large enough that we're able to have 20 meters between the two towers. So once you get past that 6-story podium, those taller towers, we're able to have those 20 meters of space between them. And that means it's a pretty good site to have 2 towers. So those are some of the policy directions that we look to. As well, when we have a larger site, that helps us mitigate impacts of the development on other neighborhoods and other houses. So generally speaking, development will have some sort of impact, so we have to do our best to try and manage that. So a good example is with the way we're trying to orient the parking. There's underground parking, and the way we're trying to have people drive into the underground parking, that's a way we mitigate it, rather than some options are better than others for mitigating those impacts. So this graphic shows some of the high-rise zoning provisions. So the high-rise zoning provisions, they are currently under appeal. They're intended to be part of the zoning bylaw. And the provisions have different setbacks as they relate to other parts of the land. So between the two towers, it wants 20 meters, and those high-rise zoning provisions also have different requirements for things like the lot size. So one, for instance, is it wants 1,150 square meters for a corner site, and we have over 4,000, so that's a way we're satisfying that. And then the rear yard setback is another example. So a rear yard setback for the building taller than 9 stories is 10 meters. And as you can see here, we exceed those 10 meters in a few different areas. And so another area that's of a lot of consideration that was for both people working on the project and for folks who are here tonight listening to this presentation. So something that we're all thinking about is parking. So the City of Ottawa has been doing a lot of work to try and reduce parking in high-rise developments and encourage people to take transit, ride a bicycle, or walk. And that's a pretty important way of trying to encourage people to shift away from car ownership and find other means of active and public transportation. What that means on our side is when the development was being considered and when the parking was being developed, trying to find that balance between providing enough parking so that the new residents of this proposed development don't wind up parking on side streets and neighborhood streets, but also so that we're not over providing parking where it winds up costing those residents who might buy a unit but not own a car. That could end up costing them more in the long term if there's just too much parking and no one's using it, because that's a burden. So what all that means is the parking spaces here have been developed with a lot of those considerations. So it's really trying to find a balance. So the parking here, we proposed 231 parking spaces for residents, and there are also visitor spaces proposed. And then for bicycle parking, there's 342 spaces. So there is more bicycle parking proposed than vehicle parking. And one thing that's also good to consider is that Taggart has experience in seeing how the proposed parking rates get used in their projects after they're built. So they are the ones who are thinking about what do we need to build to make sure that we're not providing too much or too little. And they can look back on previous projects to say, did we provide enough or did we provide too much? And another interesting thing is that when we provide bicycle parking, so this project, for instance, has proposed bike rooms. So there's one bike room for each tower. And there are also bicycle parking on the ground floor as well, which is really convenient if you are a bicycle commuter and you ride your bike every day. And that's really helpful as well if you want to get to Experimental Farm. There's an unpaved path just south of Carling Avenue that provides direct access. So providing bike rooms and bike storage at grade is a good way of making it easier for people to get around, as is the bike. You might be able to see it in this pop-out graphic. There's a bike tune-up space. So there's one per building. And that is it for me for my portion of the presentation. I will pass it over to Matthew next, who will take us through some of the traffic.
Thank you. The current medical office building generates less than 70 two-way vehicle trips during the morning and afternoon peak hours. 25 of these trips are using Parkdale to head southbound to access the site. As for the proposed residential building, it is anticipated that the site will generate 80 two-way vehicle trips during the morning and afternoon peak hours. Since this is primarily a residential building, the mode shares have been adjusted with the higher transit ridership and active travel percentages using the 2020 Trans Report. Next slide.
Did you skip a slide there by any chance? Or is it my turn already?
It's your turn, Patrick.
All right. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Patrick Guisson. I'm from Hoban Architecture. And thanks for coming out this evening. So we just wanted to run you through where we are at today. And keep in mind that it's still early days, and what we're here to do today is present to you where we're at and how we're proposing to essentially advance this project. So as Tamara mentioned, we're proposing two buildings, one of 22 stories and one of 28 stories, a total of 462 units. We have a wide variety of unit mixes within the buildings, ranging from studios to 1 and 2 bedroom units. One thing that's important to note is when we were looking at the site and how we wanted to place the buildings, we wanted to ensure that we minimize the overlap of the two buildings by essentially staggering the building forms, which, you know, on the northeast corner, we have that parkland dedication. And so that gave us an opportunity to create a landscape buffer between the north residential sort of edge and our building, but also gave us the opportunity to slide that east building further north, creating sort of a more public urban space at the corner of Carling and Parkdale. So I'm just gonna, I think I can draw on this here. There you go. So we have our main entrance is located here for the first building to the west. And this is our main entrance for the east building. We have over here, we have 2 bus stops that will remain. And then our main vehicular garage access point is off of Hamilton, located there. We've located our service access points in the sort of back of the building, if I can use that term. Unfortunately, you know, these buildings need to have these service rooms, and we wanted to locate them where it made sense. And so we have an access point for loading, move-in, and removal of waste at the back of the building happening through here. We essentially wanted to ensure that the ground plane was activated by programming it appropriately and making sure that the uses that we put down there sort of created that sort of more vibrant urban realm at grade. You can skip 2 slides, please. So some of the major sort of design narratives that we were considering while sort of taking the first blush at designing these buildings was connectivity, built form and urban fabric, and public realm and street animation. So if you can, next slide, please. So as Tamara mentioned, I mean, this site is essentially well connected in terms of access to public transit, the future LRT, and also to existing infrastructure of multi-use pathways. Next slide, please. And so from that perspective, as Tamara indicated earlier, it was pretty important for us to locate usable facilities at the ground floor for the various modes of transportation that people will use. So ensuring that our landscape design is open and accessible as you can walk through it freely. So there's various access points at grade where you can exit the buildings to access the bus stop or walk over to the LRT. Our bike rooms are easily accessible and convenient for people to use that actually use bikes on a daily basis. Often we see bike rooms down in the basements of parking garages, which works, but it's not ideal for people who actually want to use their bicycle as their main means of transportation throughout the year, or at least the summer months. Next slide, please. And so when it comes to built form, Mara went through essentially the bones of how we sort of dissected the masses. I mean, we have the 6-story podiums and then the main bodies of the tower. Our ground level is intended to be fairly transparent and light, although we'll see in some of the future, the later renderings, that some of the back of house is not entirely as developed as we'd like at this point. But again, we're at early stages, and I think there's a lot of room for improvement, especially on the back end of the building where our services are. So our main floor, ground floor, is intended to be light, transparent, where we can see activities happening and where we can set up uses that essentially animate the front edge of the building. The podium itself tries to mimic some of the language that exists along Carling. I understand that there's low rise to the north of us, but in the context of the future transit station that's coming here, I think the higher density I think has merit on this site. The towers are intended to feel light and glassy, and then we try to articulate the top of the building to encompass essentially the mechanic house that always ends up looking like a wedding cake. So, in an ideal situation or an ideal world, I'd like the top of that building to really encapsulate that space so that it's part of the architecture rather than something that you stick on top. Next slide, please. So again, this is a view through the essentially the space between the two towers. We really tried to develop with CSW and Sherry from CSW. We tried to develop a landscape that was that provided visual barrier through the site, but didn't here as you meander through the site. So, because some of these outdoor spaces would be used by the tenants of the building as exterior amenity space, but to simply close it off, anyways, in our opinion, didn't make a whole lot of sense. So creating a visual barrier was fine, but closing it off wasn't necessarily what we had in mind. So again, creating a nice urban space where people can gather and wander through the site, accessing the bike parking at grade in the back is something that we wanted to keep accessible as you meander through the site. Next slide, please. And so the podium, we're trying to respond to some of the existing heights around the building. We tried to be playful with the breaking down of the mass of the podium rather than just one chunky thing. We were trying to break it up and suggest, more dynamic texture to the elevation, using balconies as another expression to break down that mass. And also, when we get above the podium, we step back to the main sort of body of the tower, providing terraces, specifically on the north end, where we try to really get as much separation as we can from the edge of the R3 zone to essentially the body of the tower. Next slide, please. And so the tower itself, again, we're trying to treat as lightly as possible in glassy, light materials, whether it's very light masonry or an aluminum panel, that remains to be seen, but that's what we're kind of thinking towards. And again, treating the skin of the building as lightly as possible so that it feels like it's not as imposing as a dark color, let's say. Next slide, please. And so again, this speaks to the urban fabric and trying to respond to some of the existing scales along Carling Avenue. Again, we do believe that setting back the east building is an important gesture to go and create that urban space along Carling. I mean, Carling will be undergoing, quite a transformation in the next couple of years, given the fact that the civic campus essentially will be transforming and moving elsewhere. So, starting to think about how the street is going to feel in the future is fairly important. Next slide, please. And so this is the view along Hamilton. And what I was saying initially about sort of the back end or back of house of the building needs some development. Certainly you can see there that it feels kind of dark and heavy, although I think there's means and methods to lighten that up and make that feel a little bit more friendly moving forward. Although we have to keep in mind that these back of house services need to exist somewhere. But cladding that in a slightly potentially a more appropriate material is certainly in the cards as we progress with the design of the building. Next slide, please. And so we don't have necessarily control as to how the parkland dedication would get developed, but I mean, it's an important part of the site, and I really hope that we can work hand in hand with the city in developing something that is complementary to the building design and then the design of the site, because I think it'd be a great asset for the community as well as for the residents of the building. And again, making sure that we have activated uses along those facades at grade is critical for creating an animated street frontage on all sides of the development, really. Next slide. So this is a view looking back towards Carling between the two buildings. Again, we're trying to really create a sort of healthy outdoor environment where people can go and gather, have coffee, what have you. Next slide. Again, similar style, just a little bit more overhead. So trying to keep that fairly open so people can meander through, and making sure that we have, again, uses that are complementary to the center space. So whether it's multi-use spaces, I mean, when I say multi-use, I mean sort of co-working spaces that maybe front onto the center courtyard, or gyms or party rooms, or even maybe spaces that can be used by the community. I mean, that needs to be reviewed by the client group, but there's enough, I think, there to potentially do that. So next slide, please. So I think this is back to you, Tamara.
Sure is. So thanks for walking us through that, Patrick. And as Patrick mentioned, there's a few areas that are still being developed. They're still in the works, so there are some opportunities for folks here to provide some of their thoughts on what they would like to see. One area that is still in the works but has had some consideration given to it, so that you can see it, just as an idea what it could look like, is that open space at the corner. So this is a view looking at northwest at the intersection of Carling and Parkdale. And that's an area where some sort of open space is being contemplated. And this would be in addition to the parkland dedication. So really this would be adjacent to the future LRT station and the current bus stop. So the bus, if it were stopping there in this render, it would be stopping a little bit sort of near those three trees to the left. So the relationship of this open space and how people would interact with it as a resident or as a bus rider or a future LRT user, that's something that there's some opportunity to provide your feedback on what you would like to see there. So we're definitely open to hearing from folks on the call what they would be interested in. And I also realized that one of my slides I must have deleted in my slide deck. It is here we go. There we go. It's a quick vehicle movement diagram that I put together just because I wanted to show some of the things that Patrick was annotating on the screen, which is all of the different movements that will be coming into the site and traveling through them. So I thought this was important to annotate on the site plan, basically that any traffic, anyone who is driving onto the site will have an underground parking garage that will only be accessible via Hamilton Avenue. And that would be south of the traffic barrier. For folks who are familiar with it, you can't actually travel from Carling to Ruskin via Hamilton Avenue because there's a physical traffic barrier with some trees on it. So what would happen is you would, if you wanted to drive into the site, you would drive west along Carling, north on Hamilton, and then you would go into the parking garage. There is a center median that would not permit a left turn onto Hamilton Avenue. So this is what folks call a right in, right out, where you could go right into the site and you would drive right out west on Carling to exit. The other point that was mentioned earlier in the presentation about loading. So we're proposing in this design to have the loading through the back of the site. And as Patrick was mentioning, there's some future design work to be done to refine the back of house operations. That would be loading for loading into the building, like moving, or if there were people servicing the building. So trades workers, for instance, would probably access it here. The traffic generated by that is much lower than people parking their cars every day because it's less frequent. And that would be north of the traffic barrier. And so I mention this because one of the areas of discussion that we're interested in hearing folks tonight as well is whether that traffic barrier should be left as it is, or if it makes more sense to actually move it north so that all of the traffic and loading movement would be happening on the south end of Hamilton, and it wouldn't be going through that residential neighborhood at all. That is something that we will take the feedback and consider it and work with the city to figure out if that makes sense or if that would cause other problems. That wasn't in the development application, mostly because it's a really big question and we are still, there's still a lot to be worked out. So with that in mind, there are 4 areas where feedback would be really appreciated from folks on the call. So first off, the southeast corner of Carling and Parkdale, that landscaped open space. If you have ideas on what you'd like to see there, please let us know. As well, landscaping on Parkdale. So the building has been pushed back a little bit. The sidewalk will be wider than it is today. And there's part of the design, the landscape concept plan proposes trees, incorporating that bus stop into the landscaping and a wider sidewalk. If you have ideas on how this should look and what you'd like, please let us know. We can take that all down and work on it further as we refine it. As well, the parkland at the rear. So the park will be dedicated to the city. They will be the ones building it. But what we can do is we can think about how the building relates to that park. So if people want to have, well, just let us know what you'd be interested in. If you want to be able to see into the building or a mural, or really, you tell us. I shouldn't tell you what to tell us. And then the traffic barrier, like I mentioned earlier. So those are the 4 areas we're specifically interested in hearing from folks about. Please share. So if you have a question, please feel free to tell us what you think about that. We would love to hear it. And I will end it there and turn it back over to the counselor's office.
Awesome. Okay, so we'll go into the Q&A period right now. I've already got quite a few questions written down. And some raised hands. I would suggest at this point, send something into the Q&A to indicate you want to speak as well, because it's quite hard to keep track of the hands going up. Alongside that, to let everybody know, because this is being recorded, we will be putting this up on YouTube by the end of the week. So if you have any neighbors that couldn't attend or had any questions that they couldn't bring to us tonight, they'll be able to review that on YouTube. You can look up Kitchissippi Ward with 1081 Carling. You should be able to find it, or you can write me and Jeff at the office with your questions and we'll help you get them answered. And we can pass on any links to the recording later. So with all that said, the first hand up I did see was from Elaine McGregor. Elaine, I'll allow you to speak if you still have a question. If not, just let me know. I'm not finding you in the participant list anymore. Oh, there you are. Okay. If you'd like to ask a question, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I have a question about the the whole idea of this particular development, because what really flabbergasted me about the presentation was when this was referred to as one of the larger sites not developed in this area. And I'm going, wow, if a 9-story office building is not developed, it really leaves me quite flabbergasted in this whole idea. I'm also deeply concerned that this project is not in the spirit of the new official plan, which I've just been reading over the last few weeks. In particular, it's directly against the idea of a 15-minute neighborhood. The whole civic hospital area, which I've lived in for many years, has not enough business development and not enough office development and too much residential development, other than, of course, the hospital. And to take away a very useful office building where you see, I have my pharmacy, the physiotherapist, bunch of doctors' offices, the place where I go and get my blood tests, all sorts of things that are extremely useful and necessary for this particular area, and in fact for the whole Hittenberg area as well. And just take this away seems to me to be not in the spirit of the official plan, and therefore not something that should be encouraged by the city. So my question for the for Taggart and people is, why on earth did you pick this particular site and not the site at Holland and Carling?
I can try to answer that. So those are good questions. I think I'll do my best to answer that. So we don't, well, first of all, we don't, Taggart does not own the site at Holland and Carling. We own this site. This is 100% owned by Taggart, the site at 1081 Carling. And it is quite a large land area compared to some of the other sites along Carling Avenue. And we saw this as a great opportunity to create some densification in the neighborhood, which is something that the city is looking for in terms of their official plan, and I think also in the new official plan, since it's still considered to be close to transit and a future transit station, we saw some great development or development potential in this site. So that's essentially why we chose this site. We own it, and it is one that is close to some potential for increased development. So what we always try to do with our sites is try to find the highest and best use for the property. And in our research and our investigation with the site, we found that was with a residential development. So that is something that our office continues to do over all of our properties, just to make sure that we are using them to their fullest potential. And with our investigations, we found this was the best and most highest and best use for this particular site. So at over 4,000 square meters, we found it was a good location for what we're proposing, and that's essentially what we how we got to where we are.
My name is Derek Howe. I just want to say thank you very much for everybody for joining us tonight. I know you've had a lot of meetings in the past over the Civic Hospital Master Plan. So, thank you for joining us tonight. I just want to build on one point that Braden Walker mentioned, and something that may not be as apparent to many of the people. So the Taggart organization has owned this asset since about 2013. And what may not be readily apparent from the building day to day is that the building currently is almost 50% vacant. I would like to, let everybody here know that we own not one, not two, but 3 medical facilities across the greater city of Ottawa. And we're experiencing what I would call their medical facilities, one in Findlay Creek, one on O'Connor Street, and one at this site. I would suggest to the group that we are experiencing the changing nature of the practice of medicine right now. And the practice of medicine is now shifting from I would say respectfully, the older model of a 1 or 2 practitioners working in a smaller building, such as a medical building. And they're moving into what we would call health hubs, which might have 5, 10, 15, 25 doctors, and they all basically work as a health cooperative supporting all of the patient. The best example we have of this is the new Monfort facility that was built in Orleans. So I think, while I can appreciate this, Alana, I believe your name is, I can appreciate the concept of the people having current appointments and current practitioners that they visit. We've been working very hard for the last 5 years with, I would say, relatively little success in maintaining or increasing the number of tenants that are in this building. And right now we're doing some planning to plan for what we fear may be a building that's almost, nearly empty. And I think in terms of the site itself, I believe, with the new civic hospital that's being proposed, I think there'll be an increased demand for residential housing for the many hundreds of professionals that will hopefully come to the city of Ottawa to be working in this area, et cetera, alongside medical residents, et cetera. So I just wanted to emphasize that the office building, there's another question there about the underutilization of this asset. It is, like I said, the building is currently half empty, and we do have some arrears in rent of even some of the people that are paying there. So just wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of that. So I will turn it back over to the chair, please. Sorry, Mr. Leeper.
No, thank you very much for that answer. Folks, I noticed there are 26 questions in the Q&A. For those of you who have seen our open houses online, we don't normally open the mics. We do ask you to type the questions into the Q&A. It makes for a little bit less of a prelude, unfortunately, to the question, in which I know people want to sort of make their feelings about the development known, but it does give us the opportunity to get through a lot more questions, because I know that there are a ton of them. So if you've put in a question that just says you'd like to ask a question in person, please just type your question into the Q&A, and Stephanie will read those out one at a time. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, sorry about that. I've still got the order for most of everyone, so we'll still continue to follow that. But yes, we'll be taking questions from the Q&A in that case, and just going in order as they appeared. I'm trying to take one question per person just because to keep the order going. So moving on from Armane's first question about the underutilization, Julian asks, how will you guarantee that no one will use the small street going to Hinton? If anyone would like to answer, I think it's sort of been answered, but nonetheless.
I believe there is a traffic stop on Hinton, so you cannot actually drive northbound going west on Carling through Hinton. You have to go to Holland. So we don't foresee anyone using Hinton Avenue to access the site, if that answers the question.
If you're referring to the small pathway that goes behind the building next to the proposed development, that is a private property, and it would have to be observed by that party.
Okay. Going to the next question from Barbara Levine. She asks, could you tell us more about the makeup of residents? So sort of to package it all in one, are the buildings intended to be rental or condominium or both? What is the breakdown currently between studios and larger units? What income level will a resident need to be to purchase or rent? And what accommodation will be made for lower income individuals or families? If you guys can answer it at this time.
I'll start with the first half of the question. So the two buildings are intended to be rental. Currently, we are aiming for a unit mix that looks somewhat like this. So 10% bachelors, 60% that comprises the 1 bedroom and 1 bedroom plus den, and about 30% that encompasses the 2 beds and 2 plus dens. As far as what income renters will need to have to live here, I mean, it depends on what the sort of rental target is. And I think the client group can better answer that. And as well, the question on affordability, I'll hand that over to the Taggart group to see if they'd like to answer that one.
Sure, thanks, Patrick. So it is quite early to answer these in a definitive way. I think right now we're looking at this building as a rental building, but obviously we're keeping it open for the potential of altering it if the economics work as a condominium. like Patrick said, we've got a variety of different units, different unit sizes, and the rents for those units, given that the project is several years out, it's very, very difficult to forecast what the rents will be in the future, but we'll be, looking for essentially the market rent for the area. And as for affordable or lower income housing, that's something that we're always open to considering, and something that is never really off the table for our developments. And I know that there's some elements of that making its or attempting to make its way into the official plan, a new official plan. So that's, I guess, yet to be seen for us in terms of exactly how that will be incorporated. But we're obviously not going to target this to a certain income level, and we're not going to restrict this to a certain type of tenant. It's going to be as open as possible to as many people as we possibly can.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question from Alan Thompson. Alan asks, so just wondering if there is no ground floor retailer services to give something back to the local community, bank, coffee shop, urban spice style mini grocery, would think a streetscape and invited non-residents to use this space would be appropriate. So if anyone would kind of like to speak to retail on the ground floor, I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, I'll start this one off a little bit. I mean, the notion of commercial space at grade has been discussed many times as we were looking at this, and the question of its viability always comes up. I don't think we, as a sort of development group, are.
We lost Patrick.
Seems that way.
In this location.
Oh,
He's back there.
Sorry, Patrick, we lost you there for the last little bit. So in short, I think it's a very good question that was asked. I think that we'll absolutely look at ancillary uses for the building itself. It is just not clear to our group right now whether or not there is a significant demand for a community facility or a community destination within the base of these buildings, is feasible or not. So that's just something that we just have to look through, but there is space at the ground floor plane to accommodate, some commercial tenant. We just don't know enough today to permit that. And our ground floor heights are probably between, 4 and 5 meters to the underside of slab. So there'll be fairly generous spaces. So I think it will be desirable space. I just don't know how much and who will go there. So that's it.
That's exactly what I said.
Okay, fantastic that it was answered in both cases. I hope. Forgive me, I'll move on to the next question, which was from Julie H. We'll just find your questions below. So Julie asks, number one, will you consider leaving the traffic barrier on Hamilton and moving the entrance exit for the back of house truck traffic to Parkdale? And then secondly, what are the chances you'll begin construction earlier than the suggested 2027? And 3, are these towers, well, for rental unit, we did ask that. So just the first 2.
Sorry, the first question was, will we move the barrier or will we not?
Will you consider leaving the traffic barrier and moving the entrance exit to the back of the house, truck traffic to Parkdale? Leaving.
So I think the first of all, we when we had our initial meeting with the planner and the councillor, that was something that we brought up. Admittedly, the history of this barrier is somewhat vague by most people, and many people don't really know why it was put there in the first place. But I would say, to Mary mentioned, we really want to consult with the community as to whether it should be moved or not. So what we tried to do was maintain the status quo and develop a plan with Holben and Parsons, our traffic engineer, to maintain the status quo of that barrier. But we are prepared to enter into discussion, if appropriate, to move that barrier northward.
And I think it's perhaps also worth mentioning that I don't think there was ever a discussion of removing it entirely. So during all of our discussions looking at this site, the question was always, is the traffic barrier in the right place? And never should the traffic barrier be gone. Yeah.
Correct. We're not proposing to eliminate it at all. We're not proposing at the time to eliminate it. It's there for a reason from the past, so we're going to respect that.
I think the other part of that question was, would we move the loading zone off of Parkdale? Is that right, Steph?
Just give me 1 second, I'll find them again. So yeah, would you consider moving the entrance exit for the back of house truck traffic to Parkdale?
Okay. I think we tried to keep as much traffic off of Parkdale as possible. We recognize that it's a busy street, and adding any traffic flow or driveways onto that street didn't seem appropriate from our review, and we tried to keep everything away from Parkdale as much as possible to keep the cars off that street and access people backing up and pulling into the driveways on Parkdale. We tried to avoid that wherever we could.
And also, Braden, just to add to that, I think our analysis showed that during peak hours, the queuing on Parkdale came back far enough that restricted any possibilities of having an entrance off of Parkdale, which, you know, if you had loading, would cause backups essentially along Parkdale during peak hours. So something that we considered.
The loading zone is a very, it's a sort of occasionally used space for, especially for the tenants. It would be for move-ins and move-outs, which typically occur during initial lease up of the building and very occasionally during the life of the building. And then it would be for garbage pickup, the periodic weekly garbage pickup, which would happen at the same time as the rest of the residential neighborhood.
All right, and just the last part of that question was also, what are the chances you'll begin construction earlier than the suggested 2027? If you think you can speak to that. If not, I'll move on to the next question.
I guess that's another one that's difficult to answer, I suppose. We don't really have a definitive timeline for starting the project. I think at this phase, we're really just looking to get feedback from the public and from the city in terms of our development proposal. And we're looking to just lay the groundwork for potential future development at the site, and not, we're really not planning for breaking ground at this point in time.
Got it. So moving on to the next question from Thomas Kruger. Sort of, I'll try and draw out the question. He'd like to know why the developer is designing the building for the context of Carling Avenue with almost no regard for the neighborhood immediately next door where people actually live. The plan, I'm just talking about kind of how out of scale the plan seems to be, with the building facing away from the neighborhood it purports to be a part of. So if you'd like to address that, I'll leave it to you.
I could maybe talk to the planning side of it, and then perhaps Patrick, you could speak to the architectural side. Great. So some of the, there are a couple of policy documents that guide the way that buildings are designed. One is the, so there's one section of the official plan, section 4.11, and it talks a lot about the building design and massing and scale and high-rise buildings in particular. And a lot of what these policies, so that's one area. There are guidelines called the urban design guidelines for high-rise buildings. And then there's also high-rise zoning provisions. They're currently under appeal, but they're proposed to amend the zoning bylaws. So there's three sets of policy, oh, I can't see. There's three sets of policy documentation that we're looking at when urban planners provide guidance to the architects, and when we talk to each other about what the building has to do to comply with either policies and what parts of the guidelines we're looking at when we're designing the building. So there's a few different levels of policy documentation. Some have different, some rank differently in the hierarchy. So when we look at the official plan, these developments there's a couple things to keep in mind. So one is trying to create a street wall along Carling Avenue, and it's called a street wall because you're trying to create a very consistent row of buildings that's associated with sort of urban density. There's elements that Patrick could speak to more about rhythm and the way that those facades work together. On the planning side of things, we look at how a consistent street wall can frame a street, especially when it's on the other side of open space. So because the south end is experimental farm, that street wall is the only street wall on that side. So that is one way where we're looking at responding to Carling Avenue. And another thing to keep in mind as well is Carling Avenue is an arterial main street, and that has with it consideration on how it wants the building to relate to that street. So that's why if you look at the plans, the building is oriented to face, it faces Carling Avenue, and on Parkdale, it's pushed back a little bit to provide that open space because the policies seek to respond to those spaces. And then when we get to the back, and on the other hand, when we get to the back of the building, the policy documents don't have as much guidance on that. So the planning policy documents that I'm looking at often talk about how we're trying to relate to the street and have that urban scale and the relationship to things like roads, public transit, cycling facilities. And those kinds of policies are the things that we're responding to. When it comes to the relationship to the residential neighborhood, often those documents are talking about distancing and separation and making sure there's enough space between the building and the towers. So one of the ways that a tall building responds to a residential neighborhood is by having a very narrow tower. So the floor plate is much smaller on the tower portion versus the podium. So that's why a lot of our drawings show the floor plate being much bigger. The way that building responds to the residential building is by trying to push the tower farther away from them and make sure that there's space. Though, to provide a few examples, I should pass it over to Patrick, as I feel like I've perhaps spoken a fair bit on this.
I just want to make a quick note that there are 54 questions in the chat. So,
and
Yes.
it's 8 o'clock. Just to wrap that one up, in terms of, I mean, the design of the building and quote unquote turning its back to the rest of the neighborhood. I mean, I understand the optics of it. It is a a dense proposal, but in terms of the architectural design, I mean, I don't believe it's necessarily turning its back to the community. I mean, we do have the northeast component of the site that is parkland dedication, and we love, again, like I mentioned before, we love to work with the city in incorporating that as part of our, or at least developing it so that it works with our development. But in terms of the building design itself, I mean, we've tried to incorporate steeper setbacks on the north side for two parts. One is to comply with the required separation distance from the R zone, but additionally is to add additional stepping to the building as it goes up. So we have, I think on both buildings, we have a 2-story stepping at the top to provide some terracing. And then we have the level 6 setback, which provides a significant terrace overlooking sort of the community to the north. And at the south side, again, trying to incorporate the corner public landscape area, I think will be is important, because as you're coming down Carling and eastwards along Carling, we want to open that up towards the future development of what will be the civic campus. So I do think that there are some articulation, some building articulation and gestures that do speak to the building not only facing Carling but also the north side. Next question.
Okay, so moving on to the next 2 questions, semi sort of related with sort of official plan stuff. The first is from Candice Halpert. There's no residential buildings of a comparable height in the vicinity. There's a 15-story across the street, but it is inaccurately labeled as a residential building. The planning rationale is related to short-term space for the hospital zone, institutional zone. Green space is inadequate for the size of proposed towers. How does this proposal and height fit within existing character of the neighborhood and meet the capability objectives of the official plan?
Okay. I can start out, and maybe Tamara and Patrick, you can help me out after I'm done. I think, I mean, it's true. There's not a lot of in the immediate area high-rise residential buildings. However, there are some being developed. It does take quite a long time for these large developments to occur. So there is some further down Carling at Westgate and further east on Carling near Dow's Lake, which are quite a bit taller than what we're proposing in the instance of the developments near Preston Street. So those are some examples of high-rise buildings, not necessarily the immediate area, but in the vicinity on the same street. And sorry, the next part of the question was, how does it fit into the context, I think, of the neighborhood? I suppose and I guess in terms of the official plan as well, the city is looking for densification in certain nodes of the city. So that would be near rapid transit. This is an arterial Main Street property. So there is in the official plan potential for increased density at the street, given the proximity to transit. So that it does fit in with the intention of densification in terms of the written nature of the current official plan. I don't know, Patrick, if you have anything else or Tamara on that. But.
Yeah, just to confirm, I was just trying to find the question since there's a few parts. It's from Tanis Halpape. Okay, yeah, so let me see, there notes. So there were concerns about the green space being inadequate for the size of the proposed towers, and how does this proposal and height fit with the existing character of the neighborhood and meet capability objectives of the OP? So the green space was proposed, that's a 10% parkland dedication. So that's where the size of the proposed green space comes from. And in addition to the proposed green space, there's also that open landscape space proposed at the southeast corner, and also some amenity space proposed throughout the site. So in that regard, the parkland dedication is also has other green space proposed at this point in addition to it. I think we mentioned that that's still being worked out. So in that regard, it is going above and beyond what is required by the city, which I think is perhaps important to note. And as well, one of the really big benefits of proposing this development north of Experimental Farm is that's immediately accessible to future residents as green space and open space. With regard to how the proposal and height fits with the existing neighborhood and the character of the neighborhood, that's a good question. It's tough to answer because any building that's taller than another building is a different character. And at the same time, the character of the neighborhood is also changing, which is a policy of the official plan. So when we look at those arterial main streets, there's policy direction for those areas to change. And the official plan does direct that additional height and density and new character to a certain degree to key roads and designations. So Braden mentioned this is a node for development. The official plan seeks to direct growth to specific locations. So in that way, it's building up a new character along Carling Avenue, creating that street wall and adding additional height and density. So I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, I think that did help. I hope. And I'll move on to a second question sort of regarding official plan stuff. So Christy Ross has a two-part question. She says, according to the official plan, high-rise development is only permitted if the development provides community amenity and adequate transition to the adjacent low-rise community. So the first part of her question relates to the community amenity requirement. What is the community amenity beyond the required parkland dedication? And the second part of the question relates to the adequate transition to the low-rise community. How do you feel that an adequate transition has been applied to low-rise community? And has 45 angular plane been applied as part of your analysis?
Yeah, so the community amenity is being considered as that landscaped open space to the southeast of the site. That's an area where it's still under development. So one important thing to know is the process we're at right now is trying to figure out if this zoning and bylaw amendment is something that would be able to move forward with the city in its discussions. So when we talk about landscaping, that's usually something that comes at a later point. Those drawings have been provided to try and give everyone here an idea of what's being proposed. The rough idea right now is an open space sort of component, and it would be some sort of green space with trees and benches. That's the rough idea, but like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, if you have thoughts on how it should be provided, please let us know. We're able to take down all that feedback and continue to work through it. And with regard to how the transition is dealt with, so I had that screenshot earlier with the different distances between the podium and the tower to adjacent neighborhoods. That's the main way where we're looking for that transition, is trying to make sure that those heights and those building, both the building and the tower, are far enough away from the adjacent communities. So if we look at, for instance, the high-rise zoning provisions, the zoning bylaw high-rise zoning provisions, which are under appeal. So one of the provisions is the rear yard setback needs to be 9 meters. There needs to be a 10-meter rear yard setback above 9 meters. We've proposed 19 meters and 24 meters instead of 10. So we've gone above that. And the tower separation for 2 towers on one lot, according to those provisions, are 20 meters. We have, and this proposal also provides 20 meters between the towers, the 2 towers on the site. And then the last one is whether a site is even big enough to handle towers. So a lot needs to be 1,150 square meters, and this site is for over 4,000. There are other zoning provisions, and like the person mentioned, angular plane is one of them. We don't have angular plane done for this project. We've been using the official plan direction and the high-rise zoning provisions. So those are what we're using to guide the development of this. And I will stop there before I overdo it.
Sounds good. Just as a note, for the sake of sort of getting to all the questions, I won't be reading anything that's clearly phrased as a comment. And otherwise, I'll keep moving on with the questions in the chat.
Right.
Yeah.
Feel free to read out comments, and feel free to read out questions that sound like their comments in full.
Oh yeah.
Because it's the only way that people who are watching this later on YouTube will be able to see it. But obviously, there's a lot of disagreement that this meets with the official plan. A lot of concerns around that, and the most important part of providing your feedback really comes after this meeting, when you start to email and lobby Kimberly to try to get her to write a recommendation refusing this application. At the same time, developers, of course, are trying to convince her that their interpretation of the official plan is the correct one in order to get an approval recommendation. So feel free to read the comments in full, but we'll really only try to put questions that have a specific answer or specifically answerable back to the developer, because we now have 71 questions in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Could we also just refer to the time of the question? Because I'm scrolling through just trying to find the time. I apologize, but yeah, that would be my only request, so that we can so I can find the question and read it. So sorry, go ahead.
Sounds perfect. I'll refer to the timestamps on them.
You're doing great, Steph. Thank you.
Thanks. So kind of starting from the top with the questions, our mains had a question on how does the applicant feel about the less energy efficient nature of their design, since it's glass instead of a standard brick and mortar and insulation.
I'll take this one. We're still in early days.
34.
Thanks. We're still in early days, and energy efficiency is becoming increasingly more important. And it's certainly something that the client has in mind. Again, what we've depicted today is a first blush at sort of a direction. So, but energy efficiency is important and will be considered when we start digging into this more carefully.
The next question from Anonymous says that it seems that this project has turned its back on the community. I cannot imagine living in a 2-story house in a low-rise area next to this out-of-scale building. We'll note that as feedback and thank you for providing your feedback. The next question comes from Denise Eisner, and she asks, can the deck be shared with the Civic Hospital Neighborhood Association by tomorrow morning to the applicants?
We have no issues with that. I do want to just make sure that everybody on the call is aware we made several attempts to reach out to the CHNA over the last couple of weeks, but admittedly they had multiple priorities relating to the Civic Hospital master plan. So we never had a chance to sort of give them a pre-consult of this presentation, but absolutely we'll provide our materials right away, and we'll make sure that Tamara gets that to Councillor Leeper's office tonight.
That sounds perfect. So if anyone would like those slide decks as well from the CHNA, we'll have them, we'll forward them to you in the morning as well. Anonymous says that this seems to be presented as a foregone conclusion. How did a building of this height get approved in our neighborhood? This hasn't been approved yet. This is just the initial application, but we will note the feedback with regards to the height concerns. Susan C. Smith comments that the traffic flow is underestimating the traffic north and south on Carling. And we will note those traffic concerns as feedback as well. And to get to Gary Lindsay, he asks, will anything actually be able to grow in the Parkdale Park besides moss, given it will be in the shade from the building most, if not all the time? This leads to what shade and what areas will be shaded by this development. If Pat, I saw you raise your hand, if you'd like to answer.
We have run sun shadow analyses on the proposed development. And again, given the staggering of the two buildings, the park does actually get sunshine. I have the sun shadow right now, the sun shadow study in front of me. So from June 21st, obviously it's the highest point of the sun, but still June 21st, you get sun in that back courtyard from 12, essentially 12 till 5, 12 till 6. Obviously, as you progress into the year, sun angle drops a little bit and you'll get less, but it's still, I mean, it's not always in shadow.
I think it should be noted that even a building with the as of right would cast a shadow on that park area. The height sort of makes the shadows longer, obviously, but that park would be in shadow with a building using the as of right zoning heights. So.
Perfect. In that case, I'll move on to the next comment from Susan C. Smith, which is a continuation, I think, of her traffic concerns. So she says that this does not address the increased traffic down Holland and back through the neighborhood over to Parkdale with the right in, right out on Carling. Queensway access is at Parkdale, so traffic will come and go in that direction. So Susan, we will note your comment as feedback for the traffic concerns with the development, because I think there are some questions that will come up as well, continuing through this. I guess this has sort of been answered, but JP Nolan says, I apologize for the sirens. Have you done shade modeling to see what impact this will have on the neighborhood? Unless you'd like to maybe speak to this a bit more, because I think there's quite a few questions that are really asking about the shadow sort of question and the shadow modeling you've done. This is at 7:46 if anyone would like to refer to it.
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, the sun shadow study analysis has been, should be on DevApps. And it captures essentially, June 21st, March to September 21st, and December 21st is the major sort of time analyses and date analyses.
I have the sun shadow drawings in front of me. I can share my screen to show it for a moment. Would that be helpful?
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, I'll do that.
Are the sun shadow on DevApps?
I just have it inserted into the presentation, but it is on
They-
DevApps.
It is in
Yeah,
DevApps right now.
They should be.
We will make sure that if it's not there, that we get through Kim Baldwin. We'll make sure she has the sun shadow study, and that will be provided in the dev app if it is not already there.
So this should show the sun shadow study. And as Patrick was mentioning, it looks at June 21st. There's an assessment of what the additional shadow impacts would be on top of the existing building. And then there's September and March 21st and December 21st. So I can leave this up while Stephanie, you ask the next question, just so people have time to sort of squint at the renderings, if that's helpful.
Yeah, I think that would be great, especially for the following sort of shape questions that we will likely pass. So the next question comes from Walid Fahim, and he asks, will there be any commercial spaces for existing businesses, or will they have to move out? If you feel that this can be spoken to.
Derek here. I think, for Walid, I think that's a good question. The shortest, simple answer is I don't know yet, because we haven't figured out how we're going to be phasing this project in terms of moving forward with Tower 1, Tower 2. But I think that what we would do as an absolute minimum is that we would want to be working with all of our existing tenants in the building, find out what it is that they would like to do, and we'll try to work out a plan with each and one of our valued tenants, going forward. But, as we mentioned right from the beginning of this presentation, this is not something that's happening in the next 12 to 18 months. This is many years away, and some of the businesses that are already in the building may not be there in a number of years. So just jumping right ahead, I do not know the cumulative density of all the other high-rise residential buildings around Preston Street. We're focused on this site. I am intimately aware of the articles that have been put forward as part of the Civic Hospital Master Plan, which guided some of our thinking around traffic on Parkdale, etc. It is worth noting that the existing development generates a lot of the traffic already and contributes to some of the irritants that have been listed, such as cutting through Holland in a eastbound direction. So I don't think we will be introducing brand new behaviors, but we're definitely aware of the concerns there. Will we incorporate the existing medical office buildings in the existing 1081? We will be giving some thought to having some mixed use in terms of floors 2 and 3 in this building. It is something that we have sort of talked about, but I think as part of this process, we are in early days and we're looking for feedback. So this is a great constructive suggestion that we will be sitting down with Hoban Architecture, and we will be looking at, is this something that's feasible to incorporate a level or two of office space? I do want to stress, though, we are still trying to understand the impact of the new Civic campus in terms of how that will impact. It's worth noting that people are not interested in being in a 50-year-old building right now. So I have to figure out why they're going to come to this new building when the new campus is moving further away from the existing campus. So, but absolutely, we'll look at offices. If there's a demand from the medical profession, we absolutely want to listen to those people.
Thank you, Derek. I appreciate you taking on the next two questions, and going to the next one from Susan Bailey at 7:48 p.m. She asks, when is there supposed to be an LRT line on Carling? I want to flip that to Jeff, just because I was a little unsure of when the LRT was exactly planned for there.
Yeah, and we don't have a date. All we know is that some kind of surface rail has been in the transportation master plan for post 2031. We are in the process of creating a new transportation master plan, and it will almost certainly continue to have that line on the map saying that there will be eventually surface rail on Carling Avenue. And at some point, we will take a look again at the affordability of all of the transit projects and transportation projects that we want to fund over the long term, create a new affordability plan and get that online. But that's not going to happen immediately. So the earliest anything would happen would be 2031. I don't think anyone here is under the illusion that it's going to be anywhere near that time frame. Bus rapid transit, though, could be much sooner.
Awesome. Thanks for helping with that. And the next two questions sort of speak to the retail use and the potential uses of the building. Bradley asks, so why not just convert the site into a health hub? A question mark. I think sort of we've spoken, but if you'd like
I can answer that question. So I think the question from Marilyn is similar. Mm-hmm. So the health hub is actually a provincially legislated mechanism to attract medical professionals. And it is a source, as I understand, of a sort of guaranteed funding for a certain number of years that entices, quote, a health hub to be established to service a population. The reason you see them in Findlay Creek and in Orleans is because there are a significant number of suburban households out there with a large population base. I am not sure that we would be able to establish a provincially mandated health hub, several hundred meters away from the existing civic hospital and, a few more 100 meters away from the new civic. So there's some more research in terms of the provincially. But when we talk about the health hub, we have 25,000 feet of medical office space that is empty right now. So we are desperately trying to attract anybody who would like to practice medicine there. And respectfully, we are not having a lot of success from time to time doing this.
Perfect. So moving on to the next sort of comment question from Anonymous. I don't understand why Tigard is not respecting a clear direction from the city and residents on height restrictions. Why don't you adjust your business model to respect the preferences of residents and elected officials? That's not a responsible approach. It's based on ROE and not the express preferences of the community. It's a bit of a more broad comment / question, and we will take it as feedback for both the planners and the applicants. Sort of scrolling through to Melissa Black's question at 7:51 p.m. She asks to help retain the residential nature on Hamilton and Parkdale and help provide an appropriate transition to a larger apartment complex. Would the proponent consider building 2 3-story freehold condominiums along the back of the development and fronting on the park, and replace or relocate the loading facilities with a row of townhomes? Anyone would like to speak to that?
I can take a portion of that question with regard to, oh, it just disappeared. I think it scrolled up. So with regard to the possibility of constructing 2 to 3-story freehold condominiums, there was some contemplation in the planning rationale that the zoning along the arterial Main Street was pretty jagged and not consistent. So we have proposed that it might be worth considering rezoning 425 Hamilton Avenue South to also be arterial Main Street to provide a transition property. I know Braden and Derek could perhaps speak to their conversations they've had with they've worked on having some conversations with that property owner. They broached the subject, but that would be one way of providing a transition from the proposed development and the adjacent low-rise neighborhood. And that's, I'll just comment on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question from Melissa here. It's an interesting thought, or maybe solution in some way to better transition from our site to the neighboring residential buildings to the north. As Tamara mentioned, the site is a little jagged, but we have no commitment to we don't own the property of 425 Hamilton, so there has been no commitment to rezone their property. However, we do feel that it should be considered as part of the arterial Main Street zoning, considering the way that the zoning bylaw speaks to, an official plan speaks to the depth of an arterial Main Street zone from the street. But having said that, I mean, it's a great question, it's a thought, it's something we can definitely consider, and you know, we'll it's obviously not part of our proposal now, but we'll take a look at it, and maybe that's something we can further investigate.
Fantastic. So Farah, it's a sort of echoes a question about commercial spaces for existing businesses, which Derek has addressed, or will they have to move out? So sort of we've touched on that. So I'll move on to the next sort of comment question, which is from Julie Waddell Smith, who asks about the shade study being completed and can't be shared, which I believe both Kimberly and Jeff shared in the chat. If anyone would like to refer to it there, you can also find it on the DevApps link that we mentioned earlier. And moving on to the next question from Joe Martyr. He asks, what criteria does the city use to decide whether to approve major zoning changes such as this proposal? This is a bit of a large question. I'm not sure, Kimberly or Jeff, if you'd like to maybe talk about the process of it for those.
Yeah, and I think I would like to ask Kimberly, because it's obviously a very neutral question, and Kimberly's job is to listen to all the feedback, to talk about, you know, the right that property owners have in Ontario to ask for rezoning, and how you as a planner make a recommendation to council as to whether or not that rezoning is justified.
Certainly, thank you, Council Leeper, for the question. So yes, in Ontario, under the Planning Act, any property owner has a right to file a zoning bylaw amendment application for the city to review and consider. And so it's my role as a city planner to review the application with the provincial policies. It's called the provincial policy statement, as well as the local planning regulations and policies such as the official plan. We also take into consideration council approved guidelines such as the urban design guidelines for high-rise buildings in this instance, as well as the urban design guidelines for proposals on arterial main streets. So that's kind of a high-level overview of some of the items and policies and regulations that city staff look at in considering a proposal. And then I also have a team behind me as well that look at some of the more technical elements such as civil infrastructure and transportation review as well.
If you if you want to understand, I know I put the DevApps site in there. The developer has asserted that the current zoning doesn't fully fulfill the objectives of Ottawa's official plan. And if you read their planning rationale, that's always the key document that I'm looking at, your community associations are looking at, community lawyers are looking at, is the planning rationale. And ultimately it comes down to different interpretations of that planning rationale. Areas where we in the community might disagree with the interpretation that the developer has made of the official plan and its various policies. That's the fundamental starting point. And Kimberly's job is to determine, you know, whether this does in fact meet with our official plan according to the arguments that the developer has put forward. And I'm more than happy. I had a good chat with a number of Civic Hospital residents the other day to talk about this. Always happy to take people through the planning process and describe how it actually works.
Fantastic. Moving on to the next question from Gord Rabjohn. He says, I'm concerned about Parkdale traffic. Your numbers seem to indicate average traffic flows will be similar, which seems optimistic, but current traffic will be spread out throughout the day, whereas the new building will concentrate traffic at 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. at a time when Parkdale is already at capacity. I'd be interested in understanding what Parkdale traffic will look like at peak hours. How will vehicles get from the building to the 417 eastbound? It must be through the community. If you'd like to address the traffic concerns, and perhaps specifically the 417 questions, since there's quite a few other questions about cars coming off the 417 and going to.
Hello, thank you for the question. So eastbound traffic has two options of accessing the Queensway while heading out of the site. One would be heading northbound on Holland and finding its way to Parkdale through one of the adjacent local streets. This is about a 1.3 kilometer trip, depending on which road you take. It could be a little bit less, a little bit more. If you head directly westbound on Carling, it's about 1.7 kilometers, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, to get onto the highway to head eastbound as well. So typically vehicles will go path of least resistance. And I should also mention that the site is already anticipated to generate about 70 vehicles, 70 2A vehicles during the peak hours in the morning and afternoon. And the site is adding about 80, less than 80 during the morning and afternoon peak hours at the same period. So we're only looking at an increase of about 10 vehicles. So thank you.
Okay, and have you guys put up a traffic impact assessment with the DevApps or?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
okay.
It was done with using peak hours assessment, but we follow the 2020 trans report, which has changed how the modal shares are calculated and how the peak hours are calculated. You can find that online, I believe, on the City of Ottawa website as well, or you go to trans.
Awesome. Yeah, I was going to bring up that it is also available on DevApps in that case. So the next question comes from Elizabeth Mellinson, who asks, the geotechnical report noted that the kinds of equipment used to build 4-story underground parking garage cause significant vibration that can damage buildings nearby. My home, like most houses, was built in the 1930s. It suffered significant damage when the new sanitation and water lines were put in the neighborhood a few years ago. What is the developer planning to do to ensure residents' homes won't be damaged? And if damage occurs during construction, will the developer be responsible for paying for structural repair? If anyone would like to speak to that.
Yeah, so it's our standard practice that any homes that are in close proximity to the development site will be requested to permit access, respecting COVID regulation, to have a pre-construction survey done. And we will use an independent third-party pre-construction survey firm, and they will do a survey of the foundation, wall cracking, any drywall cracking, nail pop prior to any blasting commencing. And then we monitor in terms of the City of Ottawa has horizontal vibration limits that they are expected to have maintained on the site. So our civil company, Tiger Construction, does a number of deep foundation excavations. So we're very experienced in this. But I think to the core of your question is, it is our responsibility to survey your home prior to construction, to be available to answer any questions you may have. And then at the conclusion of the blasting or construction activity, we go back in and we do another survey. And obviously, if there are some significant changes that have happened from point A to point B, then those are our responsibility, to make some reparations with yourself as a homeowner there. So that's sort of a standard City of Ottawa practice for us to consult with homes that are in close proximity. So.
Great. So moving to Jerry Robinson's question from, we're at 7:54 p.m. in Q&A currently. It seems we're building more and more residential units without sufficient supporting amenities, like grocery stores, etc. Where is the nearest grocery store we expect to reduce auto use? I don't know if anyone can necessarily speak to that currently. But we can also note it as feedback, sort of about concerns about nearby amenities that will be available to the development. If anyone would like to pop in with an answer, feel free. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next question from John LeBrun. And he says, water and sewage concerns relative to what we experience with seniors residents adjacent to this development. Delivery vehicles are much larger than anyone would imagine. Delivery is not as intended. This is especially envy for the Hamilton people, which we will also notice as feedback with regards to the deliveries. Ron, and I know Jeff is currently looking for questions, so if you'd like to interrupt with any of them further down, I'll keep going. Ron Pinder also asks, why didn't Taggart work with the community before this design got so far? My work, we consult with community/user stakeholders at the beginning and are brought in as part of a design team, and we'll take this as feedback concerning this development as well. Sort of at this point, I'll keep going sort of in order of questions. Anonymous says, given the outrageous height of the proposed towers, Jeff, did you want to interrupt or not? Okay. Okay, so Anonymous says, given the outrageous height of the proposed towers, what, if any, consideration was given to the existing residential neighborhood? This proposal doesn't fit with the character of our community in the lease, which we've spoken about earlier, but also continuing to take the feedback on how this fits into the character of the neighborhood. Christina Cameron from 7:56 p.m. says, where will the children play? The pocket park will not be adequate for 462 units. If anyone would like to speak to that, we can also take it as feedback for the current proposed size for the pocket park.
But I mean, I can speak a little bit too. I think it's a good question. The size of the park was determined based on the City of Ottawa calculation for parkland dedication. So that's 10% of the land area. We were told by the state that they did want to designate it as land, as a park land, and the actual use and function of the park is not really known yet or determined. We don't know what it will look like, and we're hoping for the community to provide some feedback on that. That would help us in determining how to properly incorporate this park into the development, or at least help the city with determining how this park might function. But I would say I don't think all 462 units would be using the park all at once. I think it would be, a few people here and there. So I think, a 450 square meter park is a okay size, but definitely if all 462 residents were in it at one time, I think that would be a little crowded, but I don't think that's what's going to happen.
It's also just worth noting, sorry, so that there is amenity space interior to the building in addition to the public parkland dedication. So the city's bylaw requires 6 square meters of amenity per unit, which would be provided in addition to the public parkland dedication. So that would be in the building or potentially on terraces, that sort of thing. So that's over and above the parkland dedication.
There's a question that I think is quite legitimate. I'm looking through the list, and a lot of the stuff is obviously related to traffic concerns, the height of the building, the parkland, and I'm going to take a couple of minutes at the end just to sort of lay out again how the process works and where you should send that feedback. There is a question from someone though. It was posted at 24. If this zoning change is approved and a precedent is established, what would prevent developers from buying houses on Carling with a view of tearing them down and seeking a zoning change so that more residential towers would be built, using the same argument that the rezoned property would represent the best and use value for the property? Approval of this zoning change could lead to a slippery slope concerning the loss of homes and small businesses on Carling. And I think I would put that to Foten.
So yeah, Carling Avenue is an arterial main street. It is a target area for intensification, like we've heard from this through the policy documents. So the city identifies it as a corridor for intensification, and it's identified as a corridor for rapid transit, which adds an additional layer of focus from the city's policy documents for intensification along that corridor. There are specific nodes along the corridor. Excuse me, I am sick, so it's good that we're doing this meeting on Zoom, but I apologize. But there are nodes along the corridor that have been identified for additional density. So those specifically would be the intersection of arterial main streets with transit priority corridors, or sites in proximity to future transit stations. And so we're starting to see lots of this sort of development all up and down Carling Avenue based on these policies put forth in the official plan, which envision the intensification and the conversion ultimately over time of Carling Avenue to a more mid-rise and high-rise corridor. So that is the intention of the street in the city's official plan. When I say mid-rise, I mean up to 9 stories, and high-rise is 10+ stories. And so the official plan, the new official plan, continues to speak to that sort of policy direction in terms of taller buildings along Main Street corridors. And it speaks, of course, to the compatibility and the transition between neighborhoods and the corridor. So it's not suggesting that buildings should provide no transition. Obviously, transition is subjective in terms of how that's achieved. It could be through setbacks, angular plane we've heard mentioned tonight. There are lots of ways to achieve transition, ground-oriented housing. That's another one we heard tonight. But ultimately, we need to demonstrate how, in our opinion, it's transitioning. We may never come to an agreement, though I hope we do, as to how we transition into a community. But that's the intention for Carling Avenue, as it is for all arterial main streets in the city.
There's another good question that was posed at 8:45. How do cars moving east on Carling access the building?
Matthew, do you want to take that, or there you are?
Yeah, sorry, I clicked on the Windows key and I lost track. So cars heading eastbound on Carling are expected to make a U-turn, or they will be taking a different path throughout the city. So that could either be through southbound Parkdale, or they could be getting off later off the highway if they're heading eastbound, and then excuse me, and then heading on Carling eastbound. So there is options. It is we anticipated a high percentage though of U-turns for the site generated traffic.
Okay, and at 8:45, another sort of different take here. Could there be commentary as to why there are no family units with 3 bedrooms incorporated into the towers?
Yes, that's a great question. I mean, we don't have any currently, although I think if there's a demand for it, it certainly can be explored. Typically, we don't typically see a lot of 3 bedrooms in a this sort of development. What we do see though is a 2-bedroom plus den, where the den can actually be used as the 3rd bedroom. But specifically 3 bedrooms tend to get on the larger side, and the rents start becoming a little bit more prohibitive. But that said, I mean, it's not off the table, and it always comes up. Family units always come up as something that people are looking for, and we can table that in terms of how this project evolves.
And then I did have one other comment here from Daniel at 8:27. And this is, I read it out because we don't get many of these comments during the open houses. I think most of the people who come out to these are very concerned about the towers. But one commenter did say, details matter, and many of these questions and concerns are, of course, legitimate. But as someone who lives down the street from this site, I actually hope that Kimberley and the city will not lose sight of the big picture here. Ottawa is a growing city that desperately needs new housing supply, more density for livability, environmentally, and affordability reasons, and Carling is completely ripe for it, at least relatively speaking. So that's a different perspective this evening, and has some very significant validity. Steph, I don't know if you saw any other questions that are sort of haven't been asked or not in the general vein of comments?
I did notice a question just about accessibility, especially with regards to disabled users of the Parkdale clinics. I thought it might just be good to ask that before sort of wrapping up potentially. So Elizabeth Mellinson asked at 8:16, many of the disabled users of the Parkdale clinics park on Inglewood, often on both sides of the street, even though there is no stopping on the south side of Inglewood. It is not unusual for school buses and delivery trucks, as well as cars, to be blocked from getting through Inglewood, either to turn onto Parkdale or turning onto Inglewood from Parkdale. This is exasperated in the winter. How is it possible that increased delivery traffic to the rear loading delivery area, think Amazon parcels and Uber Eats, as well as regular delivery trucks and moving trucks, especially coming from Parkdale, for 462 residences, do anything but create a storm of traffic on Inglewood, especially at Parkdale and Inglewood. Potentially just good to speak to traffic concerns and accessibility around the site.
Yeah, that's a good question. Lots of details in there. I think in terms of like short-term drop-offs and things, we would see a lot of that likely happening at the Hamilton Road entrance. More than likely it would happen there, just off of Carling Avenue. The loading bay at the back would likely be more for larger delivery trucks, garbage, that type of thing. Which the purpose of that is to get them off the street and onto the property. And make sure they're not holding up any traffic or parking in front of somebody's house for extended periods of time, that type of thing.
I'm just going to read out one more and then I'm going to wrap it up. There is a question from Mark, which is a process question, which is where I'm going anyways, which is, if the major zoning amendments are granted, please explain the process for considering additional variances and revisions after the fact. For example, in that phase, do these additional variances require public consultation? I will say it is not unheard of that after a building, a really significant complex project like this has received its zoning amendments, that sometimes in the course of doing detailed design, they have some small tweaks that they want to make. And so they seek variances for those. The most common course for that is to go to the Committee of Adjustment, just as your neighbor might if they're seeking to put an addition on their home, or like somebody has to do if they want to go get an infill. And those variances are taken a look at by the Committee of Adjustment according to its 4-part test. And if anyone wants to write to me about what that is, and that's a hearing to which the public has a right to make submissions. Derek, got your hand up.
Well, I'm going to let you finish. I wanted to, with your permission, Council, I wanted to address sort of another theme which we haven't talked a lot about here, which is related to the affordability side of things. So, I mean, I think from our perspective, and this is me speaking personally, you know, I think there's going to be a huge demand for employees at the new Civic. And I think one of the things that perhaps we don't do a good enough job expressing is that on some level, the most affordable type of unit is a 2-bedroom unit that has 2 young professionals that are working in close proximity, such as the hospital. So when we look at the combination of the face rent divided by 2 roommates, it actually becomes some of the most affordable, relatively speaking, to their incomes in the area. So I think, you know, there's been a number of comments here that are talking about sort of high-end occupancy, high income. I would suggest that we're trying to cater to other areas, other personnel on the income spectrum. Admittedly, not everybody is a couple or partners, etc. You know, sometimes there's a need for just 2 roommates. So I think that's something that we're trying to put forward there. I mean, I do appreciate many of the concerns that have been raised, but I think there's a fundamental lack of housing stock, period, in the city of Ottawa, and we're trying our best to alleviate some of that, you know, in terms of going forward. So that's just one of the sort of themes that we didn't really have a chance to answer on that. And then the other one, more because Marilyn at 8:01 was suggesting, I have no authority to move the traffic stop. We're simply trying to engage in dialogue with the city planning staff, the councillor's office, and the community at large as to the best approach forward to eliminate traffic in Hamilton North versus Hamilton South. So that's what we're trying to do. And we're trying to put our best foot forward to consult with the community on the best approach for the entrances and egresses off of Hamilton. So I'll turn it back over to you, Councillor, in terms of your final remarks or any other questions people would like to ask.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I do appreciate everyone coming out this evening. There's a lot more comments in the Q&A than we could possibly read out, and certainly this is one of the more heavily engaged processes I've been in quite a few number of years. Just in terms of where we go from here, the developer has made an application to the city for a rezoning, and the next several months are going to see Ms. Baldwin talk to her colleagues within the city of Ottawa. She mentioned folks like civil engineers and transportation experts, et cetera, to hear their concerns. You and I are going to be writing to her about our concerns with the project. And the most helpful ones, the ones that really start to move the needle, are the ones that are grounded in the city's policies. And I know that many residents are looking at retaining a planning lawyer who can make those arguments to Kimberly that, there is a policy reason to reject this application. And Kimberly's and her team are going to be looking at all of the feedback that is coming in. And then sometime, several months from now, she is going to be writing a report that makes a recommendation to Planning Committee of City Council to approve the development or not. Generally speaking, in the course of all those discussions, changes get made to the building. If Kimberly determines that she can't support 2 towers, she can only support 1 because of transition. And I promise not to lobby her this evening, but she will let the developer know, here are some changes that I need to see in order to stay on an approval path. You will rarely see a report move forward with a refusal recommendation, because the Planning Committee of City Council will generally defer to that opinion on the part of the city planner. So eventually it will turn into some sort of a amended proposal that Kimberly feels is able to be approved, in her professional opinion, to Planning Committee. Planning Committee will vote. Then City Council will vote on what then becomes the Planning Committee's recommendation. And then it is appealable to, we used to call it the OMB, the Ontario Municipal Board, which many of you have heard of. It's now called the Ontario Land Tribunal. So the final decision of City Council is appealable to that body. And because that OLT is the final word on these big complex proposals usually, it is really important to craft as much as possible the arguments that you're making in terms of the policies that the city has, because the OLT doesn't care about politics. What it cares about is policy. So over the course of the next few weeks, write to me and write to Kimberly about your concerns about this project. We've heard a lot of things this evening, but tonight is not an official meeting. Write your comments by email to kimberly.baldwin@ottawa.ca and jeff.leeper@ottawa.ca. I'm going to be lobbying Kimberly to press for changes to this proposal. And I'm going to keep the Civic Hospital Neighborhood Association looped into what I'm hearing and what I'm doing on this file as well. Kimberly, do you have any kind of a target date for when this might be heard by Planning Committee, like a realistic target date?
I don't know. It all depends on kind of the back and forth and communication amongst all the stakeholders interested in the proposal. But as for the formal process in terms of public comments, it's a 28-day comment period. So the comment period will be coming up on the end of the comment period is October 21st. So if possible, please try to have your comments in before that day. But of course, we will continue to accept comments up until a planning report is actually written for Planning Committee and Council.
Would it be fair to say that a very complex application like this one, which is still in its very early days, could take upwards of 8 months before it gets to planning committee?
Well, certainly, yes. I guess the on-time process that you'll see on the city's website, I believe, is 4 months for a zoning application, but that's quite rare that process moves to city council that quickly. So there's certainly a lot of discussion and back and forth that takes place prior to an application being heard at the planning committee.
Fantastic. So I would urge everyone to please join your community association, the Civic Hospital Neighborhood Association. And I forget, maybe Stephanie, oh, actually, could you just pull up very quickly the Civic Hospital Neighborhood Association's website? Is it chna.ca?
I'll
Aaron,
check.
text me.
I'll go grab it real fast and I'll put it in the chat.
Thanks. So please join your community association, send your feedback to Kimberly and myself. And otherwise, I just want to thank the developer team for coming out to present the proposal, and to thank all of you for coming out this evening to hear about it. And this is just the very start of the conversation. And the Civic Hospital Neighborhood Association is at
chnaottawa.ca.
chnaottawa.ca. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening. This video will be available within a couple of days on our YouTube channel. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Have a good evening, everyone.
Everyone.